You have questions, we have answers. This is Jane Muller.
And this is Ken Muller. Welcome to our show, all about real estate with Ken and Jane, airing every Sunday from 10 to 10:30 on Fox Sports New Jersey, 93.5 FM, 1450 AM.
Ken, don't try. You better keep your day job. Doesn't matter how much you mimic the
I can't do it as well as Mike. All right,
That's
right. At least he's got that Fox Sports New Jersey.
That's right. Yes.
All right. So what do we got today? We're going to talk about what does the waiving the appraisal contingency really mean to the buyer and the seller. So to start with, I think we need to talk about what the appraisal is, and then from there, what it means to waive the appraisal contingency. So that people have to understand, because even though we've covered this in the past, we still get a lot of questions from a lot of the sellers, a lot of the buyers, that to truly understand what it means to waive it and how the process works in evaluating whether the buyer can truly is qualified to waive it as well.
Absolutely. A lot of time, right, even though we go through that with our seller again and again and again, but they always come back to ask when I try to schedule appraisal appointment. Jane, I thought they waived it. I said, remember we say that? So I think that's important. We dedicate this program today just to cover one topic so we can go in depth what that meant and how it worked.
First of all, we should say the appraisal, basically when you buy a house, you either pay, you can pay cash for the whole financing, or you can get a mortgage, whether it be a conventional loan, an FHA loan, a VA loan, or
any type
of loan. Yeah. And the appraisal process basically is involved whenever there's a lender involved. The lender, because they're giving you a loan, their collateral is the house,
property,
that's what they're putting the mortgage on. So they're going to do what's called an appraisal, which is another word for evaluation, to see if the house is really worth what the contract price is, because they have an interest, even though they're only funding maybe 80% or 90%. They want to make sure that the money they're lending is the house value is more than the value of the loan.
Yes,
so they're going to they're going to do an appraisal. So why don't you talk about, Jane, the steps involved in the appraisal process?
The appraisal is, once again, this is a very competitive market. A lot of buyer or buyer agent write a contract, say the buyer waived the appraisal, buyer the appraisal contingency. And in fact, when you make an offer at that stage, as long as a mortgage involved, as you just mentioned, Ken, you cannot waive the appraisal, because waiving appraisal is the lender decision. But as a buyer, you can waive the appraisal contingency. What that meant is, once you have appraisal done, the bank, the lender sent to the appraiser, they will look at the market value, they look at the property, they come up with the value of this home. And then say if the value, the appraiser came up value much less than the contract price, obviously, there's a problem. The bank cannot fund it. If the house just made mathematics easily, right? If you buy $100,000 property, you put a 10% down. Okay, so you borrow $90,000, but if the valuer came, said this house only worth $85,000, so obviously the bank can't lend you $90,000 over $85,000 value, even though you negative 5%.
Jane, sorry to interrupt, but can you tell me where? I want to know where we can get a $100,000 house anywhere. I think that's basically your down payment.
What? I agree.
Tell me anywhere I know in New Jersey, but anywhere in the country you can find $100,000.
I think that's just made mathematics easier. That's all.
Yeah, that might be closer to the car. You can find a $100,000 car more likely than finding a $100,000 house or even a condo in New Jersey.
Absolutely, that's correct. Maybe we say $1 million.
Yeah, so, you can still do the math. 10% of $1 million is...
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So most cases, right, the buyer is saying they waive the appraisal contingency. What that meant is, regardless how much the bank praises, just in this case, well, make King happy, just say the property is $1 million, right, contract. The bank came, said this house only worth, in their opinion, $850,000. So obviously you have to have a cash either in the saving or retirement fund or maybe a gift from your family to make up the difference.
Right, because in that case, if the bank's value of the house is $850,000 and you have an 80% loan to value ratio, the bank is going to only fund 80% of the $850,000, not 80% of the $1 million, which would be the $800,000. So again, it's going to be $150,000 difference. So when you waive the appraisal contingency, what that means is the buyer is saying, you know what, I don't care if the bank underappraises the house by whatever value, I'm going to still buy it for the contract price. But in order to do that, the buyer has to have the proof of funds. So that's...
Yeah. I mean, once again, can go back to my banking days. I mean, as you know, I work in the bank many years as bank manager. So the first day I started a job as a bank manager doing the lending portion, my boss used to tell me, Jane, there's two things you have to always remember. One is your client, can they afford to repay? Can they afford? Secondly, is the willingness to repay. If one of them answers no, please don't lend them the money because you will never see it again. Why? I mean, ability to repay is one thing, but whether they want it or not, why I brought that up in today's topic is the same thing with the appraisal waiver, right? For example, right, we just recently had a case. The property, we think the worst scenario, because as a listing agent, we have to do a market analysis before we put a house on the market. We have to discuss with the seller. This is a strategy where you put where's the sweet spot, but to track the more bidding war. But it's still, you have to share your true understanding of the home, market value at that point. So in that case, I shared with the owner, I'm confident the current market value at least about $850, but that was last year spring. So I said the market is still rising, so why don't we take advantage of market? But we don't know how much it's rising, and definitely based on because the appraisal always based on the past 3 months. 6 months max. So, it doesn't adjust what's rising market. So maybe we can lucky get a buyer waived it. So based on that thinking, we ask $899,000.
And when was this house listed? In the spring of
last year. Last year, spring
2021.
Yeah, they're still going up that time. So at that time, the interest rate is still very low and still beating war everywhere. So we figured if we ask that $899, so if many buyers comes, they may bid over 900, but worst come to worst, we don't want to lose anyone in 800, but we try to get more if we can. And having said that, we have to make sure the buyer have to have ability and willingness to waive the appraisal, because my comfort level, which I shared with our seller, is $850 at that point. So we put on the market, sure enough, multiple bid. We had many offers, came in $990. At the end, the seller, quite a few $990. At the end, the seller chose the one couple is a $980. The reason they got chosen because they waived the appraisal contingency in the entirety. This is when you waive the appraisal. There's three levels of waiving the appraisal. One, which is a very more risky. So for the buyer, so a lot of buyer, unless they're very experienced, they may worried they would waive it entirely.
So let's give an example. So if you waive the appraisal contingency in its entirety, in your example, the list price is $899. This particular buyer made a contract offer of $980, and the bank is still going to, obviously they're getting funding, so the bank is going to do an appraisal. So when they waive it in their entirety, that means if the valuation, the bank valuation came in at $850 or $800 or $799, it doesn't matter. The buyer contractually is obligated to proceed and and buy the house because they waived the appraisal contingency, and they put
Entirely.
that in entirety. That's what entirety means.
Entirety means, yes. In that example, or one step back, right? The second is maybe the buyer don't feel comfortable. Certainly, majority of the lawyer don't feel comfortable, the buyer attorney. They want to make sure to limit potential liability, so they would put a number. At what number? Most, I think, personally, I think is fair is the above asking price, right? If it's asking price,
above the list price,
list
right.
price. So if you bid more in order to get this home, you should confident to waive that. So, but having said that, in this very competitive market, some buyer even go lower. So, for example, right, we had a 990 offer. They based on the appraisal subject to asking $899. So in that way, the seller feel $10,000. But if the place truly appraised $850, like I shared my value, so they're not gonna get it. So they rather go $980,000, but entirely.
So that's a real example. That's a very illustrative example about the different types of appraisal contingency waivers. Where in one case you have a $10,000 lower offer, but they waive the appraisal contingency in its entirety, meaning even if the house appraised less than the contract price of $899, that buyer is on the hook to buy it for the contract price.
Yes.
Whereas a buyer who you're saying in your actual case, you had one buyer who bid two buyers who bid $10,000 more, so they offered $990,000, but they limited the appraisal contingency waiver to the contract price of $899, meaning
not a contract price, the asking price.
So the listing.
price.
I'm sorry, to the listing price, right? Mm-hmm. So if the property appraised at $850, they would not
come back, renegotiate.
They could come back and renegotiate. So the seller, so it's a risk, like with anything you do in life. So the seller said, "Do I go for the $10,000 more and take the risk that it could underappraise below the list price, or do I take the sure thing and go with the $980, which is $10,000 less, but nonetheless I have the assurance I can sleep well."
Yes, absolutely. So that's really the nutshell of the waiving the appraisal contingency means to the buyer and the seller.
Right. Or there's also an option where they could limit it to maybe $20,000,
$10,000, $20,000,
put a monetary
$30,000
cap on the waiver, which could be further protect the buyer side.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
All right, very good stuff. Why don't we take a short break and we'll be right back. Okay, welcome back. So we're going to continue talking about the appraisal contingency waiver. And Jane, I want to focus on something you said about the ability that basically to waive the appraisal contingency. Of course, the buyer needs the financial ability. And secondly, they need the willingness to repay it. And I think the financial ability is something that a good list agent like yourself will pre-screen, and you'll make sure that obviously any appraisal contingency waiver, the buyer must submit, along with their mortgage pre-approval, they must submit proof of funds and show that they have sufficient funds to cover any deficit resulting from an underappraisal. But the second point, the willingness to repay, is something that you really have to screen up front, because a lot of times in this competitive market, a lot of buyer agents may write in the contract to be competitive that we're willing to waive the appraisal contingency, and and the buyers may not understand fully what that means, or they may just kind of say nonchalantly, "Yeah, we'll do that. That sounds good. We really like the house." But then when it goes to attorney review and the attorney gets involved, the buyer figures they want it, they had more time to think about it, they say, I'm not too crazy about, paying more money than something is valued, especially since the last 2 years, the market has been going up. So I'm already paying, I really want to make sure the bank is going to value me at what I'm paying, the contract price.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Ken. And recently we had a lot of contract actually get canceled during the attorney review. And it's hard to say who caused it, right? As a listing agent, we do very detailed homework. We make sure financially they're able. In the past example we said, the asking $899, and then they offer $980, and the buyer did show $400,000 saving in the bank. So we had a bank statement, so we know they definitely can afford it. And we always, as a Mueller team, we always make sure that is done. We want to have a bank statement to verify. We don't want just take your word and then during the attorney review you said, I don't have money. By the way, I have to sell my house to do that. There's limited lot of potential misunderstanding or mistake the buyer agent may have. But once again, when that happened during the attorney review, the buyer may change their mind. They can be one of the three, or combination of the three.
Why they changed
One is maybe the truly some agent didn't explain very well. I know quite a few times they just, everybody does it like a uniform, right, Ken? You just put there, we'll waive the appraisal. And when I read the contract, it's a 5% down. And the bank statement is $10,000-$20,000. I call up, I said, how are you going to waive the appraisal if you you show me the bank statement? It's barely enough for 5%.
So that leads to point number one, which is easier to pre-screen because that's black and white. You can see that they either have or don't have the liquid funds to do it.
That's
where a good list agent comes in and you catch that up front, because otherwise you waste a lot of people's time.
And the owner's time, valuable time, because at that time you had a multiple bid. At that moment, right, if you lose that moment, later on you're going back, a lot of people may have a second thought. So that's why the good listing agent always very detailed to make sure everything's done. But we only can screen to certain the ability, able, but we can't detect the wailing. The wailing came to the attorney review. Attorney review letter, truly, as I said, maybe a third the agent didn't explain well.
Now, there could be three reasons. The willingness to repay, there may be three reasons why there's a legitimate change of mind from the time the contract offer is submitted. I think you're going to say one could be, the first reason be the buyer had time. It's almost like you win something. And this happens, it's an emotional thing. A lot of times, even in multiple bids without that, when the buyer wins the house, then sometimes it happens that they decide to cancel. He said, you know what, I won. I got that satisfaction, that high. But then, you know what? Then they think, well, gee, I won. There were so many bids. I probably overpaid. I could have paid $5,000 or $10,000 less. And then they don't feel comfortable. So it could just be that emotional roller coaster. And when things settle down, the buyer just says, you know what, I don't really feel comfortable with that. And they change their mind. The second reason could be the attorney, the buyer attorney is overprotective and basically tells the buyer that it recommends against their legal advice. It's not a good idea to waive the appraisal contingency because you're going to be overpaying for the property and once again, we had that issue. The buyer bid the house, and based on the truly understanding, the buyer had a $200,000-$300,000 down payment. So definitely not down payment. The down payment, the buyer was almost 50% down that case, right? So obviously, there's no problem, no ability. The ability is 100%, and the willingness 100%. But during the attorney review letter, the attorney said they have subject to the satisfaction of the appraisal. At that point, the seller want to cancel. Because I said to the seller, don't jump to the conclusion. Maybe you're just the attorney. So sure enough, when we push it back, said, well, if the contract will accept based on that understanding, if you take away the foundation of the contract, unfortunately, the seller has to cancel. At that point, the buyer attorney wrote back and say the buyer, against his advice, they would like to buy waiving the full waiver of the appraisal contingency. So that's really, that's where the attorney conceded into the wishes of the buyer who really wanted the house.
Yes.
So what would be the third reason that the willingness to repay could be changed?
I think a lot of time is combination. It's really, I found now the things so fast. Some agent just write a contract, just like a just like part of the contract already in the line, the special the second page, right? The special
with the home
clause,
inspection, where the home inspection is limited to major structural, environmental, radon, et cetera. Where that really, again, we covered that in previous shows, but really the limitation is very.
They just basically wrote in there as a part of it. Obviously, a lot of buyers, experience, they just sign it, and then when the lawyer, when they really read it, they say, "Hang on a minute, that's not what we're great." But that's why, as a good buyer agent, we have to sit down with the buyer, just do the math like we did before the break, right? If this house asking $500, worst come to worst, if you look at the comps, they may come 450 or 420, have you got enough fund to cover it? That's number one.
And
number
also,
two,
and
how
also
you
that
feel
comes,
about it.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but also that comes to the buyer agent having a really good conversation with the buyer, because they may have enough funds. They may physically show you they have enough funds, but they may have other lifestyle things or other commitments for those funds for college or student loans. So you have to make sure that the buyer has the funds and they're comfortable. And I guess that relates to also, that overlaps with the willingness to repay.
Yeah, they have to speak to the loan officer as well. I always, when I used to represent a buyer, I always discuss with the loan officer, because who knows the buyer truly ability better than the loan officer? They had all the financial, because I don't ask my buyer how much money you make and what debt you have, what asset you have. So the loan officer had that private information. So in that case, always consult the loan officer, let him and her run few scenarios. In that way, you're prepared and make sure you understand what the buyer are waiving. What the risk involved. That's very, very important part of it. I think another question I often get with the appraisal is, sometimes the seller asks me, do we get a report? Jane, is the appraisal back? Do we get a report? Answer is no. The report, the appraisal report, is ordered by the lender. The buyer pay for it. So generally speaking, that's the buyer's report. Unless if they come back to us and say, hey, you asked for 500,000 and the house only appraised 480.
Assuming there's no appraisal waiver and you're back in the old days where basically the house has to appraise at the contract price, otherwise it's otherwise the buyer has the right to renegotiate the price.
Or in these cases, as you mentioned, sorry to interrupt, in this case, just like you mentioned before, if the buyer put a cap, say if the house appraised 450 and they paid 500, right? If they put a cap 30,000, so they're gonna say, hey, even 30,000, you have to appraise 470. Mm-hmm. Now you only appraise 450. What happened to the 20,000? So in that case, the buyer will supply a report as the base of the argument. So I always say to seller, when we get a report, there's never be good news. Right. There's more things coming here.
But sellers are very curious. A lot of times they want to see that report. They want to know that what their house appraised at, and like you said, it's confidential, and you won't. And basically, you should be happy if there's no issues, if it's not raised.
No news is good news by that time.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right.
So when you have the report, and that's the base, and a lot of sellers ask me in this case, Jane, if they don't have, if the waiver is 30,000 with the contract is 500, the waiver is 470, now only price of 450. What happened then? What happened then is negotiable. It's really, sometimes the buyer may say, I already paid 30. That's just not fair. You have to eat the other 20. So the contract have to be reduced by 20,000 or 20,000 credit back to the buyer. Or if it's better, maybe the buyer and the seller can settle somewhere in between to settle the difference, the 20,000, right? So once again, it's up to negotiation. But certainly in the very strong seller market, the seller can take a tough stand and say, no, I'm not going to do nothing. Either you want it or not. And that's really based on how strong other buyers in pipeline. If there's no other strong buyers, if the sellers stick to that, if the deal fell through, and later on the next appraisal could be the same or even less. So the next buyer could not even waive the 30,000, could only waive 20 or 10. So that's a lot of risk involved.
Right, and that's where the list agent has to come in and advise the seller based on the comps and based on the marketability of their home. That's where the advice,
the current market,
the current market, and it's a risk calculation, but that's where you have to rely on the advice of your realtor to guide you in the process and say what's a reasonable negotiable settlement on it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. One thing I want to bring to everyone's attention, we covered in previous show when we interviewed the loan officer. The bank sometimes do give a appraisal waiver. They do.
Right,
but
they do a drive-by.
But we don't know. We don't know until later. Based on the loan officer recommendation, they said sometimes the bank have a system. They put a property address in, so the bank have system knowing this place going up, going down, vice versa. Also, based on the buyer credit, the down payment, or the bank has their own formula calculation. So if that came out, say that the appraisal is waived by the bank, in that case, the seller not going to get a call for appraisal appointment because it's completely waived.
There's different types of appraisals. There's the traditional appraisal, which we're going to touch upon momentarily, but then there's also the drive-by appraisal where they'll do the paperwork, then the appraiser will drive by from the exterior only, and then there's just the desktop appraisal, and then there's a complete waiver of the appraisal.
That's right.
So we've got to wrap this up pretty soon, but you want to say something quickly about if there is a full appraisal of the interior, how to best get the house ready in about 30 seconds.
Yeah, the 30 seconds, number one, we have to always make sure to accommodate the appraiser's schedule. Sometimes the appraiser have multiple locations, so if they give us a time, please do your best to accommodate so they don't go out of their way.
And put all the lights on, make the house bright, and so the appraiser has to take pictures.
The house.
They have to take pictures. It's so neat as possible. If you're moving, obviously put the boxes, stackable. Neat is always better. Make the appraiser's life easier if it's snowing or if there's winter conditions. Make sure the driveway is plowed and like you said, accommodate their schedule. The appraiser is the seller's best friend.
That's right. Yes.
All right. Very good. Well, we're out of time. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their weekend, and we'll see you next week.